Nora Kessler had come to the co-op that morning to close out her fertilizer account. She told Delacroix at the counter that she would not be taking her nitrogen this year, and asked what small credit was left on her book. Her papers lay spread on the counter between them. The bait ticket lay there with the rest. Delacroix picked it up before she could stop him. "You went and spent it on baitfish." He said it loud enough for the whole co-op floor to hear. He held the receipt up between two fingers like it was something that might stain him. "Your ground is crying for nitrogen, and you hauled off a truckload of trash minnows." Nora did not reach for the receipt. She folded her work gloves into her jacket. She let the men at the scale counter laugh themselves out. It was the first week of May, in the spring of 1974, and the co-op in Stuttgart smelled of dust and diesel and other people's certainty. She was 29 years old, 8 months a widow. She owned 120 acres of tired rice ground out on the Grand Prairie. It had not made an honest crop in 3 long seasons. Her husband Caleb had farmed that ground his whole short life. He had farmed it the same way his father had. Then he had died in the winter under a tractor that slid off a wet levee in the dark. He left her the land, the last note against the land, and a stubbornness she had married him for. The neighbors had been kind at the funeral and doubtful ever since. A widow could hold ground for a season, most of them figured. She could not make it pay. "How much fertilizer does 40,000 minnows buy a person, Nora?" Delacroix asked the room, not her. "None. That is the answer. None." She picked up her copy of the fish ticket and walked out into the flat white light. Behind her, the laughter carried across the gravel lot. She had heard worse in the 8 months since Caleb died. She would hear worse before the season was out. What none of them knew was simple. The receipt in her pocket was not a mistake. It was one half of a plan her father had drawn up 40 years before, in a journal she had only just learned how to read. Nitrogen was the whole trouble, and everybody on the prairie knew it. The fuel crisis the previous fall had struck an already tight market. Natural gas fed the ammonia plants, and by spring the nitrogen was scarce, dear, and often spoken for before it ever reached the dealer. Nora had done the arithmetic at her kitchen table a dozen nights running. A full fertilizer program for her acres would run past $4,000. That was more money than she had ever held in her 2 hands at once. She did not have $4,000. She had $600, folded in a coffee can on top of the icebox. And she had the last note on the farm falling due that October, $3,200. The final piece of the mortgage Caleb had carried. If the crop failed a 4th time, the note would take the ground. The ground was the last thing he had left standing in the world. So the choice in front of her was plain, and it was cruel. She could spend the last $600 she had on a fraction of the nitrogen her ground begged for, and still come up short. Or she could follow her father's journal and trust a thing no one on the prairie would believe. She followed the journal. If the old ways of making poor ground pay still interest you, think about subscribing to The Back 40, where every week a patch of overlooked land learns how to earn its keep again. The journal called it the old Paddy cycle. Her father had set it down in a cramped and hurried hand near the back of the book, the pages soft and stained with river damp. It was 2 moves, not 1. And he swore his own grandfather's people had farmed this way in the Low Country, and others further back than that, in countries none of them had ever seen. Whole valleys had grown rice and fish together in the one water for 1,000 years, he wrote, and thought nothing remarkable of it. The first move she had already made, the fall before, when the fertilizer quotes came in and she nearly signed the ground away. On his instruction, she had sown the whole 120 acres to a winter cover of vetch and clover, cheap seed she could still afford. All winter the legume had grown and fixed its nitrogen into the soil, the one fertilizer a poor woman could raise instead of buy. In April, she dished it under, green and heavy, and flooded the ground over it. But a turned-under legume on tired ground is a gamble by itself. The flood wakes the rot and the weeds together. Algae blooms across the surface and steals the light. Duckweed mats the corners. Mosquito larvae and midge hang under the film by the millions, and the water can go dead and sour before the rice ever gets its share of what the legume gave. Her father had written the answer beside the problem, in the same cramped hand. "Put the fish in," he wrote. "Let them keep the water honest." That was the second move, and it was the one the co-op had laughed at. The fish were not the fertilizer. The legume was the fertilizer. The fish were only the engine that would keep it from being wasted, if they worked at all. The bait farm sat over near Lonoke, on the far side of the county. The country around there was already thick with bait ponds, and the man who ran his had more minnows some springs than the tackle shops could ever move. Golden shiners and fathead minnows by the hundreds of thousands, and every year a share of them came up culls, too small or too slow to sell to a fisherman. "You want the culls," the bait farmer said, squinting like he had misheard. "The runts I can't move. What does a rice grower want with a tank of throwaway minnows?" "I want them alive," Nora said, "and I want them cheap." He sold her 40,000 of them for the 600. They came hauled up in an aerated tank on the back of her truck, silver and thrashing, and worth nothing at all to anyone but her. But her father's journal had been plain about one thing above the rest. Fish cannot live in rice water alone. It runs too shallow and too warm through the summer, and it is drained bone-dry at harvest. They needed somewhere deep to shelter and to winter, and she could not screen and tend the whole farm in one poor spring. So she chose the 2 home paddies nearest the low corner, 10 acres in all, and made them ready for the fish. The rest of the ground would ride on the turned underclover alone. For a week she worked the old tailwater sump at the low corner of the farm, deepening it with a borrowed dragline until it held cool water over her head. She cut shallow channels from the 2 home paddies down to that pond so the fish could follow the cool water when the shallows heated. She screened their floodgates and outlets with hardware cloth, tacked tight to the frames, so a rising water could not carry her whole investment off to the ditch. She walked those levees with a shovel and raised every weak and seeping section she could find. When the works were finished, she flooded, and only then did she carry the tank out to the water's edge. The morning she stocked the ground, 2 men from the co-op drove out and parked on the far levee to see the foolishness for themselves. Delacroix was one of them. He leaned on the fender with his arms crossed and his cap pushed back, saying nothing now, only watching. Nora waded out to the shallow corner, where the water lay warm and green over the young rice. She set the steel bucket on her hip and tipped it. The minnows went in one long silver rope that unspooled into the paddy and scattered. The water boiled with them for a moment, then went still. She filled the bucket again from the tank and poured again, and again. She worked the levees all through the flat gray afternoon, while the 2 men watched and the rice stood ankle-high and pale around her boots. "She is drowning good money," she heard the second man say. Delacroix did not answer him. He watched the last of the silver disappear under the surface. Then he climbed in the truck, and they drove off together, and Nora was left alone. 40,000 fish, a legume turned under the mud, and a debt she could not say out loud. What the fish were meant to do, her father had written, was narrow and plain. Golden shiners and fatheads are not bottom-rooting carp, and they were never going to feed a whole farm. In the shallows and the flooded stems, they would pick at the larvae and the soft algae and the small drifting things. Where they fed, the scum and the mosquitoes might run lighter. And part of what they ate would come back to the water and the mud. That was all she asked of them. The clover under the mud would do the heavy work. That was the claim anyway. Whether 40,000 runt minnows could do even that much in her 10 stocked acres, she did not yet know. Nobody she could ask had ever tried. It did not go smooth. Nothing on that ground ever had. The first hard week came in early June. A heron found the shallows and stood in them at first light like a gray statue, and every dawn Nora came down to find it hunting her engine, one beakful at a time. A cowbell moved it off the water for an hour, and no longer. So she strung lines of flashing tin across the worst of the shallows and hung strips of rag that snapped in the wind, and walked the Paddies at sunup and sundown to keep the bird moving. It never gave up entirely. It only gave up enough. Then came the levee. A muskrat had run a tunnel clean through the south bank, and on a gray afternoon the water found the hole and began to pour out in a widening brown throat, straight for the screened outlet and the ditch beyond. Nora saw it from the house and ran. She went into the breach with a shovel and a feed sack and her own body. She packed mud and gravel against the pull of the water while it climbed her legs. The screen at the outlet was holding the fish, but the bank would not hold the flood, and if the Paddy emptied, the whole design emptied with it. Emmett found her there. He was an old grower from the next section over, one of the few who had not laughed. He had come to see if the widow had drowned herself in her own scheme yet. He did not ask a single question. He put his shoulder to the sack line beside her, and the two of them held the bank until the water quit falling. "You are going to kill yourself over a tank of bait," he said, breathing hard, mud to his elbows. "Then I will die owning my ground," Nora said. And Emmett laughed for the first time all spring, because it was exactly the kind of thing Caleb would have said. The last bad night came in the middle of the month. The air went dead and the water warmed, and she woke at 2 a.m. knowing something was wrong. In the far paddy, the one slowest to drain to the pond, the minnows had come up gasping at the surface. Hundreds of small mouths worked at the skin of the water, starved for air and the heat. She opened the shallow cut to the deep sump and let the fish follow the cool water down into it. Then she ran a thin cold thread from the well across that one paddy till dawn, and swept its surface with a board to break the film and let the air back in. By the time the sky grayed, the water had cooled and the fish had gone down into the pond. She had lost some. She had not lost them all. And she saw, plainly, why her father had made her dig the refuge first. "You look like you slept in the ditch," Emmett told her the next morning. He looked out over the water a long while, and something in his face changed. "Green's coming off it," he said finally. "Your water's clearing." He was right, and it was the first true sign that the journal had not lied. By the last week of June, the stocked water ran clearer than the open paddies, clear enough in the worked corners to see the mud on the bottom. The larvae ran markedly fewer under the film, and where the fish had grazed, the duckweed had thinned. But the real change ran wider than the 10 acres of fish. Across the whole farm, where the clover had rotted down into the flood, the rice found a richness it had been starved of for years, and it began to answer. Nora counted the stems in a sample row, and counted them again to be sure. The plants were throwing more tillers than her ground had carried in years. Emmett crouched at the levee and pulled a plant and turned its roots in his fingers. He had grown rice for 50 years, and he knew what he was looking at, and for a moment he did not say anything at all. "That color," he said, "that is fed rice. And you never opened a bag." "I opened a bag last fall," Nora said. "It was full of clover seed. The clover fed it. The fish only helped keep the bugs and the algae off what the clover gave. Through July, the rice ran ahead of every field around it. Nora walked it every evening after the heat broke, down the turn rows in the long light. Her neighbor's rice stood even and ordinary. Hers stood a shade darker, and the heads hung heavier as the grain came on, until the stalks began to lean under their own weight. Emmett had laid out better than $3,000 in nitrogen on his own acres that spring, the same as he did every year. His rice was good. Hers, standing across the turn row from his, was plainly its equal, and it carried no purchased nitrogen charge at all. He measured that difference every time he drove past, and he was honest enough to say so. A grower she barely knew stopped on the turn row and asked, flat out, what she had put on it. She told him the truth. He drove off looking like he did not believe her and could not explain what he had just seen. The note fell due in the first days of October, and the harvest came in right behind it. She lowered the paddies slowly as she cut, and the screen cuts guided her fish down into the deep pond ahead of the combine, out of the way of the header and the drought of the drained ground. The combine ran 3 days. Load after load went into the mill scale at Stuttgart, and the whole prairie seemed to find a reason to be in the lot. Good ground on the Grand Prairie made 130 in a fair year, and everyone standing there could do the sum in their head. Her tired acres, the last 3 seasons, had scratched out 90 and less. The men by the scale house were waiting, most of them, to watch the widow's foolishness come to its number at last. The weighmaster ran the last truck across the platform a little after noon. He added the clean weights, checked her harvested acres against his book, and did the division twice before he would say it. Then he called Delacroix over to check the figure himself, because he did not want to be the only man who had said it out loud. 136 bushels to the acre, the weighmaster said, clean as any rice I've took in all fall. 46 over what this ground made last year. What did you run on it, ma'am? For a moment, nobody spoke. 136 off-tired acres, standing even with the best fertilized ground on the prairie. No bought nitrogen, Nora said. Not one bag, not $1 of it. Delacroix had the figure in his hand now. He read it, and the number did not change for him, no matter how long he stared. All the certainty had gone out of his face. He looked from the ticket to the trucks and back. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the co-op floor entirely. That isn't possible, he said. You didn't buy a pound of it off me. I sold this county its nitrogen all year. I would have your name on a slip. You would not, Nora said. I grew mine over the winter, under a cover of clover and vetch. The fish only helped keep the pests and the scum from stealing it back. I told you in May what I bought. You just heard baitfish and stopped listening. The tickets weighed what they weighed. The scale did not care who was surprised. Every load came up heavy, and every load came up clean, and no line on any of them carried a nitrogen cost at all. She paid the last note that month with the mill's settlement check, $3,200 against the final piece of the mortgage, and the ground stood free and clear for the first time since Caleb died. The story did not stay at the mill. Growers she had never met drove out to lean on her levee and ask how a widow with no money had matched the prairie's best fertilized fields. Nora did not sell them a secret, because there was no secret to sell. She told them plainly about the clover turned under in the fall for its nitrogen, and the fish that had helped hold the mosquitoes and the algae down in the stocked paddies, and the deep pond that had carried the minnows through the worst of the summer. The whole quiet cycle of it, turning where no one had thought to look. Delacroix came out himself near the end of October. He stood a while at the levee where he had once leaned on his fender and watched her drown good money. He was not laughing now. He turned his cap in his hands like a younger man. I could sell that, he said finally. A grower runs his own bait ponds, covers his ground in the fall, buys half the nitrogen he used to. I've got 40 customers who would want to hear it. There is money in teaching a thing like that. There is money in doing it, Nora said. You can tell whoever you like. My father wrote it down for anybody willing to read it, but the fish are there to feed the ground, not to be sold. Strip them all out for cash and a man has only carried the good back off his own land. Keep a working stock in the water, and it comes around again every spring. She kept her surviving stock where it belonged. As the last paddies drained, the screen cuts guided the survivors down into the deep pond, and they wintered there below the frost while the fields lay bare. The next May she seen her stocking fish from that pond, grown fat now, and never bought bait again. She sewed her cover on the whole farm every fall, and each year she screened and stocked another block of paddies, and the ground that had failed 3 seasons running came back darker and stronger, while her neighbor's nitrogen bills only ever climbed. Emmett dug his own pond and put fish in his rice the following May. 2 growers past him did the same. By the 3rd year, there was a quiet row of clear paddies up and down that stretch of the prairie, where the water ran bright and the rice stood thick, and nobody laughed about minnows anymore. Nora taught it to any of them who asked. She stood on the levee the same as her father must have stood, handing down for free a thing that had been common knowledge 1,000 years before a dealer ever thought to bag a substitute and charge for it. Every spring after, when the flood went on, she poured that first bucket herself. She let the silver rope run out over the young rice, and she watched it scatter. And she remembered the co-op floor and the men who had laughed. She never sent word to any of them to come and see. The water said it plainer than she ever could. If you've made it this far into her season, then you already understand the thing the co-op floor could not. The value is never in the fish themselves. Anybody could buy a runt minnow for a fraction of a cent. The value was in knowing what the ground and the water would do with them, if a person only had the nerve to try. Nora Kessler had spent the last $600 she owned on a truckload of trash fish that no fisherman wanted. She married them to a fall of clover her father had prescribed 40 years before, and brought in a clean crop that stood even with the richest ground on the prairie. She paid off her husband's farm with it, and she never bought another bag of nitrogen again. So here is the question worth sitting with. If it had been your ground, and your last $600, and your name being laughed at on the co-op floor, would you have gambled it all on a tank of trash minnows nobody respected? Or would you have bought the fertilizer everybody swore you needed? Think on it a while. The land, in the end, remembers which one you chose.